Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here at Heavenward Thinking. Today we're tackling Genesis chapter 25, so I'm going to read it and we'll get right into today's discussion. Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Meda, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of the Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Lumites. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eladah. All these were descendants of Keturah. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar, the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Abneel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt, as you go toward Ashur. And they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. I want to stop there before we go into the story of Jacob and Esau and recap what's going on in these first two sections. The first section we have is the death of Abraham, and we see that Abraham had taken another wife after the death of Sarah that we talked about in the previous chapters, and we see that he had a lot of other sons, a lot of other children. But we see that when he leaves an inheritance, he gave gifts to his other sons and the sons of his concubines. He gave them gifts while he was living, but when he died, he left everything to Isaac. And this really shows the continuation of the promise God had given to Abraham of his offspring and the blessing that would be on his offspring, and that God had consistently said it was going to be through Isaac, through Isaac, through Isaac. And we see that here, the continuation of that, because Abraham didn't leave the same amount of stuff for multiple sons. He gave some gifts to his other sons, but he gave the inheritance to Isaac, because that was the promised son, the promise that would bring about the blessing God had given to Abraham and his family, and by extension, the whole world. It was going to come through this family, through Jesus Christ. So it's important that we see that the promise of God is continuing to be a really important factor. And we're going to see that in the coming chapters, that God's promise, his covenant with Abraham and his family, is going to be renewed with Isaac and renewed with Jacob. And we're going to see how that continues to work throughout the Old Testament. But it's important that we see these glimpses of it here, even in some sections that we don't spend much time on, which would be this first section for sure. We see that Abraham lived a long life, that God had blessed him with many years. 175 years is not something to blink at when we have the flood and the shortening of people's lives. This is still something significant that he lived many years. And then we see that his sons, also significant, his sons buried him. Even though there had been some conflict, some family division between Isaac and Ishmael and between Sarah and Hagar, we see that his sons buried him together. So whatever the case was in this, there must have been some kind of reconciliation, at least to the point of honoring their father. And that is an important thing, because for each of us in our lives, we go through conflict with people, and we have deep divisions with people, even though we shouldn't. We have that happen, but there are times that we have to come together, especially as Christians. We have to come together and have unity, where we have to come together, get past our differences, reconcile, and do the right thing. And that is an encouragement that we can take from this first section. We can see that even though this family was kind of split apart, they had some differences, they had some hostility towards each other, they still were able to come together and do the right thing when it came to honoring Abraham. And we should do the same thing when it comes to honoring God, when it comes to honoring other people. Put away the disunity in our lives, the disunity towards other people, and come together and do the right thing, because that's what God has commanded us to do. We should be able to do that, just as these men were able to do in the Old Testament, long before Jesus. And then we have the account of Ishmael and his sons, and we see that he had many sons. Once again, God had blessed Ishmael and his family line. He had promised to make him into a nation, even though Abraham had done something not very smart and had taken Hagar and had her as his wife as well, and they had tried to have offspring through her because Abraham and Sarah developed that plan themselves. They tried to accomplish God's plan themselves without asking God, and we see that it created problems like the division we just talked about. But at the same time, God still made a way through his providence, through his perfect plan, to still bless Ishmael, to still bless Abraham's descendants through him as well, making them into another nation. But we see that they lived in hostility toward the tribes related to them. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of what we're going to see throughout the Old Testament. We see some of these groups of people when they strayed from God's plan, when people tried to do things themselves, accomplish things, especially family lines, it gets very complicated, and the descendants of these people often go to war against each other, often have hostility towards each other. They go against the promise of God, and it creates significant problems. And we're going to see this, that these Ishmaelites are going to create some problems for the Jewish people down the road. But God still blessed Ishmael and his family. We can't get away from that God continued to maintain his faithfulness, not just to Abraham, but also when he promised Hagar and Ishmael that he would bless them as well. We see the faithfulness of God all throughout Scripture, and we're really seeing that as we develop this storyline throughout Genesis. So we don't want to miss that for sure. That wraps up that section of Genesis chapter 25. Now I want to move on to verse 19, the story of Jacob and Esau. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and a sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled with each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew, I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I am about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. This is an important section because it really sets up the family drama that we're really going to see over the next several chapters. We're going to see some intense conflict between the sons of Isaac. We're going to see Jacob and Esau have some bitter disagreements, and it's going to really push the story forward to a point of real conflict, and we're going to see how God works through that and how his plan is sovereign, even though these guys try to mess it up time and time again with their own selfishness and with their own desires and those things, the things that we constantly put in the way of God's plan for us and the things that we really get off track with, just like these guys did. But we see here that Isaac had a wife. He had Rebekah, and she was childless, and she prayed for God, and Isaac prayed on her behalf as well for God to bless her, to make her be able to be pregnant. And we see that God answered that prayer. Once again, he is accomplishing his plan, his purpose, and he is accomplishing what he said through his covenant, that he would make a great nation out of them. Therefore, he enabled her to have children, and she had these boys who were jostling within her, and God said that it was going to be 2 nations, and that the older will serve the younger. And that is something very significant because in the Middle Eastern cultures, it was all about the firstborn. The firstborn child had all the rights. They would get a double portion of an inheritance. They were the pride and joy of the family. They were going to carry on the family's legacy. We saw that with Isaac, as we saw in the first section of this chapter. Here we see something different, that Jacob is going to be elevated, and Esau is going to end up serving him, and we're going to see how that plays out in the coming chapters. But we also get kind of a prelude to this family drama in the end of this chapter. At the very end, we get to see this exchange between Jacob and Esau. But right before that, we get even more of a foreshadowing of the next chapter. Or we're going to see what really plays into that. But we get a couple sentences here that give us a hint of what's going to come up. And we see that Isaac loved the wild game, and he loved Esau because Esau was a skilled hunter. But Rebekah, his wife, loved Jacob more, and he stayed more with the family in the tents, and he didn't go out to the country to hunt as much, and he wasn't quite like Esau in that way. He was very different. They were very different. But we see that the parents had a problem. One of them loved one, and one of them loved another more, and they had favorites and favoritism. And it may be that this is where all the rest of Scripture gets. God does not show favoritism. Don't show partiality to people. Don't show partiality in this. Don't show partiality in this. And we see warnings of it all over. Don't show favoritism, and reminders that God doesn't show favoritism all throughout Scripture. And we see here is a great story to apply it to. We see the basis of this, that favoritism leads to serious problems. When we show a certain kind of love towards some people, and then we don't show that towards other people, when we show kindness to one person or partiality at all and favor one person as opposed to another, this is where we get into some serious problems, because then we have disagreements and conflict, and there's just chaos all over when we don't treat people right, when we don't treat people the same in this context. That's not to say that we can't have close family members or friends or anything like that, but we have to treat people well. We have to love everybody, and we have to not allow favoritism to create problems, as this is really going to create problems in this story. And we're going to see that next week when we go into the next chapter. But at the very end here is an important story between Esau and Jacob. And Esau comes in famished. He wants the stew that Jacob's making, and he is not thinking straight at all. He just wants the food because he is just going to die if he doesn't get the food immediately. And how often do we do this in our own lives? We get something in our mind that we just have to have something. We just really need something. And all of our common sense, all of our prayerful consideration, all of our taking it before the Lord just goes completely out the window. We don't even seek anybody's advice. We want something. We're going to get it right away, no matter what it costs us. And for Esau, it costs him his birthright in this chapter. He loses out on something super significant, and it's going to lead to further losses, and it's going to lead to further problems, and all of it because he wanted some stew, because he needed some temporary satisfaction of his hunger. And so many of us do that. We discard all the blessings of God. We discard all the things that we know we should be doing for a temporary satisfaction of whatever hunger it is or whatever desire it is that we have in our life. It can be all kinds of different things for each one of us, but we lose focus when we lose sight of what's truly important, which is the things of God. When we lose focus of the things of God, then we get distracted by the immediate pleasures that we want, the immediate satisfactions, or even the immediate needs we think we need, like Esau did here. And that gets us so off track, and then we lose our way, and then we lose out on the blessings of God, and we lose out on what we're supposed to be doing. And then we have to go through what Esau goes through in the following chapters. He loses out on things because he couldn't stop, think for a moment, pray, seek the Lord's advice. Just stop and think. Just consider. Just use common sense. And we need to see this as a warning for us in our own lives, and make sure that when we are faced with something, a temptation or a need or whatever it is in life, that we seek the Lord first rather than just try to get something right away, get something focused in our mind that we just need something. We need to stop, take a moment, think carefully, consider properly, and seek the Lord's advice, not our own. Because as we've seen time and time again throughout these stories of Abraham and his sons, and now playing out with Jacob and Esau, we see that when people don't seek the Lord's advice, they create problems, and we do the same thing in our own lives. So I hope you've been encouraged by this, challenged by this chapter, and that you'll join us next time as we tackle Genesis chapter 26 here on From the Beginning at Heavenward Thinking.